There are a lot of exotics in Destiny now, so I figured it would be fun to rank them all on their PvE capabilities. This one's going to be all about exotic specials, and I have heavies already on the channel and primaries will be coming out soon. Alright, starting off with our first weapon, we're gonna have Ager's Scepter. This is a very strong special weapon. It is very good for at clear, and if you have the catalyst, you can actually transfer your super to have a very high power beam. It can slow and freeze targets. It does okay DPS. Overall, it is a very strong trace rifle, and if you pair this with something like a Cenotaph Warlock, you can get a lot of mileage out of it. You don't have to run Cenotaph for it to be good on its own. It is still very strong because it can refill ammo on its own. So in my opinion, I think this is a solid A tier trace rifle. As you see, S tier is going to be meta defining. I don't think Ager's is meta defining, but it obviously is a very strong option, and that's why I'm just going to put it in the very good category. And as you see with these other categories, we do have good, mid, bad, and never used. Mid is not being bad. I know a lot of people correlate to mid being bad. It's just kind of in the middle of the pack. That's why it's going to be C tier. But next up, we're going to have Arbalest. Now, Arbalest was once an S tier weapon in my opinion, with match game being in the game, but now that that's out, it's not as strong as it used to be, but it is still a very strong barrier option, and it can also just take shields out too. On something like Ghost of the Deep, it's extremely strong because all the bosses have shields, and this can just one-shot them off, but there really isn't that many encounters in the game other than Ghost of the Deep where that is really a thing, so I don't really want to count for that. But overall, this is still a strong special weapon option. It does very good single target damage. That's why I'm going to rate it in the A tier. It has a lot of ammo. It's a linear fusion rifle. It can take out pretty much any shield that you need to, and again, it is also good against barrier champions. Now, next up is Bastion. Now, this is just going to be what is currently in the game. I know when Final Shape comes out, it's getting some new changes, but this is just going to be rankings for this season. So Bastion right now is a pretty solid fusion rifle. It does a good amount of damage, and on top of that, it can also stun unstoppable champions. Now, I don't think this is going to be a tier exotic, but I definitely think it can go in the B tier spot. A lot of people don't use Bastion, but it honestly does have some pretty decent damage output. It's not going to be the best DPS option in the game, but if you need to kill a single target, this thing can absolutely shred. And again, it does have unstoppable champion capabilities, so I think that's why it's a pretty good B tier exotic. Now, next up is Borealis. Now, the functionality of this is the fact that it can change elements, and depending on whatever element it has, it gets some bonus stats. The bonus stats are honestly more for PvP in my opinion than PvE, but overall, it's an okay option. When you break a shield, it will refill the magazine and you get increased damage, and in reality, you aren't going to use this over pretty much any other sniper, but it is a high impact sniper with 5 in the mag and crazy high stats, so a lot of people do use it in PvP if that's your thing. But for PvE, I think I'm just going to rank it in C tier. It can definitely get the job done, and the fact that it can switch elements is also a pretty unique benefit. It doesn't apply too much in the game right now since match game's not really a thing anymore, but it does get that extra damage if you do match the correct shield. And it's okay if it takes some single targets out, but pretty much any other sniper you're probably going to use, but it's okay. The next up is Barry Bloodline. Now, I know a lot of people love this thing, and rightfully so. It has a bunch of utility. It's mainly going to be used to heal you, and when you get multi-kills, you can proc Devour. When you deal damage with the gun, it heals you, and on top of that, it also just does pretty good damage in general. It's a special sidearm, so it has a lot of ammo, and on top of that, if you have the Catalyst, when you have Devour, and if you shoot someone with it, it will weaken an enemy. So overall, it can do things like an exotic heavy can do, say something like Deterministic Chaos. It weakens enemies. This can weaken enemies if you have the Catalyst. It does a pretty solid amount of damage, and it gives you one of the strongest buffs of the game, being Devour, which will also heal you and give you grenade energy every time you get a kill. So in my opinion, I honestly believe Barry Bloodline is an S tier exotic. Now, if you're just looking at strictly damage numbers, sure, there are going to be other special weapons that can out damage it, but with the pure utility that this does have, no other exotic in the game I feel like can even come close to this. Again, it can give you buffs, it can weaken enemies, it can heal you, it does so much stuff. It also does okay damage, and that's why I think it definitely deserves to go in the S tier spot. And next up is Cloudstrike. If you land multiple precision hits, you'll make a lightning storm. If you get a precision kill, you make lightning storm. So it's decent for DPS, it's decent for ad clear, and if you get the Catalyst, it has triple tap, so it makes that DPS option even better. Now, this isn't strictly going to be the best DPS option in the game, but if you do pair this with a heavy weapon, so your heavy weapon runs out, you can swap to this thing and it can actually put out a decent amount of DPS. Snipers in the game currently aren't the greatest, and that's why they're buffing them in Final Shape, but even with that, this is still one of the strongest options, especially if there's something like an arc surge on. That's why I think I'm going to rate it in the A tier. It is very, very strong for what it is. It has a lot of ammo. It's really good at ad clear too. Most people just use it for the DPS option, but just remember, if you get a precision kill with this, it will make a lightning storm exactly the same way it does when you're doing DPS with it, landing those multiple precision hits. So overall, it is a very, very good exotic, and it's definitely one I would recommend running if you just need an exotic special. Now next up is Coldheart. Now Coldheart got some changes. It can now make Onyx traces, and when you pick up an Onyx trace, it maxes the charge out to do max damage, and Coldheart is honestly a pretty good option. Now I don't think Coldheart is going to be an A tier option, but it is good, and I think if you run something like a Volt Shot weapon, you can get almost the same mileage out of it as, say, something like Coldheart. I know Coldheart can make more Onyx traces, and if you pair that with something like Geomags, it can be some fun build setups. But overall, if you don't really build into it, it's just an okay option. If you build into it, maybe I can see moving it to A, but overall, even if you do that, again, Volt Shot can still do what this can do. I don't think it's going to do it as good, but it is still a very strong option. That's why I'm just going to throw it in the B tier. But with Trace Rifles getting a buff next season, I could potentially see this moving up to A tier for every single build in the game. Now, next up is Conditional Finality. Now, this is a very strong PvP exotic. It's also very strong in PvE. It's very fun in PvE. I don't think this is meta defining, but it can stun unstoppables. You can freeze enemies with it. You can ignite enemies with it. It's very, very, very good single target damage. And if you know how to use it correctly with that ignite, it's also very strong for ad clear. Overall, this is one of my favorite exotics in the game currently, and I'm going to rank this in the A tier spot. Again, it's really not meta defining. It doesn't really do anything unique. It doesn't give you too much utility. It's not like the craziest damage. It is just a very strong workhorse shotgun with very fun benefits of igniting and shattering to get that extra ad clear if you do know how to use it correctly. Now, next up is Dead Messenger. Now, this is craftable. It can get things like demo on it, which is good, and it's okay for ad clear. It can change elements just like Borealis, and it just sends out 3 wave frame grenades. Right now in the game currently, it's okay, but if you just use Forbearance, it's honestly just better. It has chain reaction. You can heal off of it, or you can get even more grenade energy with the new one. Overall, I think this is a good exotic. I don't think it's anything crazy. I don't really think you're ever going to use your special slot for this, but if it is the only thing you have, it is definitely a good option. I would take it over something like Borealis, and maybe with the wave frame changes coming next season, this could potentially be moved to A because it will be a lot stronger than it is now. And next up is Delicitude. Now, this kind of works like Coldheart. When you pick up an Onyx Trace, it kind of overcharges the weapon. Now, this exotic's whole thing is that you want to jolt a lot of enemies, but in my opinion, things like Volt Shot can already do that, if not better sometimes in this, but it's still a pretty decent fusion rifle option. It is built for ad clear, and other things definitely are better, so that's why I'm just going to rank it in the C tier spot. It's just kind of mid. I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's anything crazy because there are other better options, namely stuff we already have in here or Volt Shot. But if it's the only thing you have, kind of like Borealis, it is usable, and I think it can get the job done, but you're almost always going to want to take something else. Now, next up, we have Divinity, and I don't even think we really need to have a conversation about this one. Divinity is an S tier option. It is completely meta defining. It makes the giant cage. Everyone can crit it. It applies a debuff. It's literally getting nerfed again in final shape, and overall, it's just crazy. It enables playstyles that normally aren't available. Say if a boss moves around a lot, something like Rolk, you can just make a crit spot on him, and now you can use things like snipers, linears, whatever you want to use. It is extremely strong. It's one of the best support weapons in the game, and the utility comes from it, kind of like Barry Bloodline, is just unmatched over anything else. Now, next up is Duality. Now, this is an interesting shotgun because you can hip fire for buckshot, aim down sight for a slug. Overall, this thing is kind of okay. I know it does have some pretty interesting setups because it does have a perk to increase its damage, but you also have to remember shotguns really aren't the greatest right now in the game. Maybe with the buffs coming at final shape, this thing could potentially be a lot stronger, but overall, I'm just going to rank this in the C tier. Again, I don't think it's anything crazy, but I also don't think it's bad. If you do build into the damage, I know you can kind of pop off with it, but just on its own, it's really not the greatest thing, so that's why I'm just going to throw it in C tier. Now, next up, we have the 3 Glaives. Now, I'm just going to kind of speed run through these. We have the Hunter and Warlock one. I'm going to just go through these in F tier. The Hunter one, it's okay. It's used for ad clear, but in reality, any other option is going to be better. I don't think you would ever want to take your exotic slot for this Glaive for ad clear. And things like the Warlock being able to apply the healing turret, it's cool, but I don't really, again, think you're going to want to take this over literally anything else. You could just throw a healing grenade. There's multiple different options. You can take something like Lumina, which is way better because it also gives a damage buff. But then you also have the Titan one. Now, the Titan one is arguably a little bit better because you can make the bubble to defend yourself. It can pair with Helm of Saint 14, but it also gives you a 5% damage increase globally that will stack on top of everything, which obviously is only 5%. It's not a lot, but since it can't stack with other stuff, I guess it is decent. So I'm going to rank it in D tier. I still think it's a bad option. I really don't think you're going to see people run this. I know there are some combos and some strategies people do with speed running, but overall, just in a normal 6-man raid, I don't think you're going to really ever see someone pull this glaive out to put a bubble down, let's be honest. And overall, these glaives still just aren't the greatest. The utility they provide really aren't the best, with the Titans being a little bit better than the other two in my opinion. Overall, again, you're really not going to use these things over anything else. And next up is Ariana's Vow. This is a gun that's got power creep. They are going to be buffing it in final shape, and I think it will be a lot better since it can ignite enemies. But right now in the game, currently, it's really not the greatest, and things like Arbalest just outperforms it. But it's still a decent option in my opinion. It has auto loading with the catalyst. It can do crazy amount of damage to a single target. It can also work with lucky pants. The downside of this weapon is that you do have to worry about your aim. If you miss, you will miss out on a lot of damage. And overall, with all that combined, I'm just going to throw it in the C tier. It's kind of just a mid exotic. It's still decent if you don't have something like Arbalest. Arbalest is going to be better, but again, with final shape, I definitely think this could be bumped up when they add the ignite capabilities. Now next up is X Diris. Now this is a fun exotic. It's really not that good in my opinion, but if you have the catalyst, you can get amplified on a kill. On top of that, it can also pair it with the Oath Keepers to play into a moth build. That's really the only thing you're using this for. I don't think you're going to see anyone just run around with X Diris as an ad clear option. It is okay. It has kind of okay single target damage, and I'm just going to kind of rank it in C tier. It's just kind of mid. It doesn't really excel at anything. It's fun to build into. You can also get it amplified if you get a kill with catalyst. Overall, the utility is not the greatest. It's kind of like Thunderlord. It's just kind of decent at like everything. It doesn't really shine at anything, so it's just kind of mid, but overall it is a fun weapon, so I'm just gonna throw it in C tier. Now next up is Forerunner. Now this is another very solid option. It's just like Barry Bloodline. It's a special sidearm, so it's going to have a lot of ammo. This one's heavily based on doing a lot of precision damage, and if you need a special weapon, just you have a ton of ammo and take out precision targets, something like a Tormentor, this is a go-to option, especially if you're soloing content or just doing low man options. Even if you're not, it's still very, very good. The catalyst on it isn't the greatest. I guess it's fun to play around, but you never really want to use your ammo to make that grenade when your grenades on your subclass typically are already going to be better. It can't do a lot of damage though, and it's fun to play around, but I would never recommend using it. But overall, this sidearm just on its own, having a lot of ammo, a lot of precision damage, it's really fun to shoot, sounds really cool. I think it's going to be an A tier option. It is used in a lot of people's loadouts just because the amount of ammo it has, the damage output it has. It's kind of like Indebted Kindness. It just has a lot of ammo. It can do chunk damage. This one's more so just based around precision, where something like Indebted Kindness, you can kind of just shoot the body. Obviously doing precision does more, but if you need to kill something like a Tormentor, if you're solo, Forerunner has you covered. And next up is Izanagi. Now Izanagi is still one of the strongest exotics in the game in my opinion. You can load up that charge shot. It does an absurd amount of damage. It's very good for single target damage. You can just pretty much instantly delete whatever you look at, and it's also insanely good for DPS swapping. In my opinion, this is going to be a meta defining exotic, because when it comes to doing extra DPS, especially if you're proccing something like bait and switch, you can shoot an Izanagi, shoot your primary or double special, whatever you're running, then go with your bait and switch. This just outputs a lot of extra damage. And like I was saying, even if you aren't using it for DPS swapping, if you need to kill something like a Tormentor, just any tanky target, a champion, you can just instantly delete them if you get a headshot, and it is very, very strong. And next up is Jotunn. Now the toaster, it's a meme weapon. It's okay. It can apply Scorch with Incandescent. It tracks enemies. I think pretty much every other fused rifle in the game is going to be better than this for DPS, maybe even single target as well. It's a fun option, but I'm just going to throw it in D tier. I don't think it's that good. I think Delicate Tomb is a better fused rifle than something like Jotunn, but in reality, you're never going to use this thing over something like an Eremite or Cartesian Coronet, and I'm sorry for the Jotunn lovers out there. I'm sorry if that offended you, but overall, again, you're not really going to use this for your special slot when you have other legendary options that can outperform it pretty much everywhere in the game. Now, next up is Lord of Wolves. And kind of like Jotunn, pretty much any other shotgun is going to outperform this. You can charge it up to have that crazy burst, and it is pretty fun. It also looks very, very cool, but overall, this shotgun, it's just kind of okay. It eats through ammo. It doesn't do a crazy amount of damage. It is a fun option, but again, pretty much any other shotgun is going to be better. Even something like Duality will be better. Now next up is Lorentz Driver. And this used to be a menace in PvP. It's pretty good at PvE, although it has an interesting perk to it where you have to pick up the 3 little things that spawn after it marks a target. It can be kind of tedious to proc, but once you do proc it, it does do a crazy amount of increased damage, and it also makes the explosion that it normally does on a precision kill, you can just do it on a body shot now. So if you do get that buff going and can keep it up, it is very strong, but with how tedious it is to get that going and to keep up, I don't really know if I can rank this higher than something like C in my opinion. I pretty much would use anything else over this, and whereas something like Arbalest is good for, I guess, for single target taking out barriers, this does have the capability of ad clearing. If you do get a precision kill, you can suck a lot of people in, make that explosion. But overall, again, keeping the buff up for that specific playstyle, it's really tedious, and I don't really think you're going to use it over literally anything else. The next up is Merciless, and this used to be one of the best weapons when Destiny 2 first came out, and it's still one of the best weapons, but it's now a special weapon instead of a heavy. You can charge it up and get that increased fire rate. If you get a kill, reload, you get that increased damage, and I honestly believe that this weapon is meta defining. It is what a lot of people use to solo things like Nezarec or just kind of any other boss in the game. It's used in low mans. It is overall just a very solid fusion rifle in general, and if you use it correctly, you get that damage buff. You can then charge up the charge rate. You're gonna sit there, you're gonna just blow all your ammo with that increased damage, and then on that last shot you can get another kill, reload. You can keep this damage buff up permanently if you are using it correctly, and it just melts through enemies. Even if you aren't using it to solo rate bosses, it's still a very strong contender for just doing single target damage on stuff like a major, especially if you do play into the damage buff, and overall it is one of the best special weapons in the game. The next up is Prometheus Lens, and this is basically just a solar 3.0 trace rifle. If you shoot a target, it will expend the laser beam so it can hit more enemies. It also applies Scorch. It doesn't apply a lot of Scorch, but it can play into your builds, which is very cool. But kind of like Delicate Tomb with Jolt, things like Incandescent can also apply Scorch, and in my opinion, I don't think you're ever going to take an exotic trace rifle, so I'm just going to throw this into C tier spot. If you do compare it to something like Coldheart, I do think that plays better into Arc 3.0, whereas Polaris doesn't play to Soul 3.0 that well. Again, it can apply Scorch, but other weapons can also do it. I guess it's okay for ad clear since it does add ammo back when you get a kill, but overall, again, you're pretty much going to take literally anything else over this. That's why I'm just going to throw it in C tier. Next up is Ruinous Effigy. Now, this is another trace rifle. I honestly think this one is a little bit better than Prometheus Lens. When you get a kill, you can make a ball. That ball can suppress enemies to stun overloads. It also gives you damage reduction while you're guarding with it. It does pretty good single target damage if you slam the ball down. It's also good for ad clear if you are guarding with it as well. The guard will also disorient enemies, so if it's a lower tier enemy, they're just not going to shoot you. So you can get a kill, pick this ball up, you're going to have damage reduction, you're going to make every single enemy not be able to shoot you. You can slam the ball, you could use it for ad clear, whatever you want to with it. You do just have to play around the ball, and I guess it's a little interesting gameplay loop. It is fun though, and again, it can suppress if you do slam, but again, I don't really think you're going to take this over pretty much anything else in the game, but it is a good option though. It is good if it's the only thing you do have. If you build into it correctly, it can be a ton of fun. Now next up is Telesto. Now Telesto is honestly just a basic fusion rifle. It can shoot little sticky bombs out, which is pretty cool, but they don't do a crazy amount of damage. The other benefit of this is that it can reload itself when it gets a kill. It can also reload your kinetic weapon too when you get a kill with it, but perks like shoot to loot exist, so you don't really even have to use this to do that. You can just shoot an ammo brick or something and it reloads all your ammo. So overall, I think this is just a D tier. It's just a basic fusion rifle with an exotic perk that doesn't really do anything crazy for PvE. And again, just legendary perks can pretty much do what this can do better. And next up is Tessellation. Now, this is a super cool concept, but in practice, it really isn't the greatest. If you get kills, you get grenade energy, then you can charge your grenade up into the gun to do a ton of damage. It's kind of like a Izanagi, but a fusion rifle, but since it uses your grenade, you can't just use it whenever you want to. You have to have your grenade on cooldown, so you do have to build into grenade focused builds to take a lot of advantage of this fusion. It can change the elements based on whatever subclass you have equipped, so if you want to run something like a triple strand or stasis build, you could absolutely do that, but overall, I don't really think we're going to be taking advantage of that too much, and that's why I'm just going to throw this in the C tier. If you do build into it, it can do a ton of damage. I just don't think it's going to be as better as other options, especially on its own. If you're not building into it, pretty much anything else is going to be better. But it is fun if you do. But overall, I don't really think you're going to take this over other options. But maybe when Final Shape comes out, if it does get a catalyst, maybe this will be pretty good. Catalyst speculation, maybe whatever element you put into the gun, see something like arc, it can jolt enemies. I think that could be pretty cool, or obviously, you know, solar could scorch. I'm not exactly sure what they're going to do with it, but if it does get a catalyst, this could definitely be bumped up a little bit, and fusions are also getting a buff in Final Shape. Now, next up is the Chaperone. Now, the Chaperone is basically a PvP exotic. It does get a precision damage increase, but if you're going to run a precision shotgun, pretty much any legendary option is going to be better. You can also just run Duality if you want to do that as well. So in my opinion, this is just going to be F tier. This is strictly a PvP weapon. You should almost never use in a PvE, although it does look and sound really cool, but you're really not going to get that much mileage out of it compared to other shotguns. And one of those other shotguns is going to be Fourth Horseman. Now, Fourth Horseman is a great shotgun. It has insanely high burst DPS. You're really only going to use it for that. You're just going to kill a single target with it. You're going to do extra boss damage with it for something like DPS swapping. And overall, this thing's whole identity is just to delete whatever you're looking at. So in my opinion, I think this is a A-tier exotic. It is very, very good. So again, very good for DPS swapping, very good for just taking out any single target. You look at it, it deletes it. That's pretty much all it's used for, though. If you're using it for ad clear or literally anything else, you're not going to do good with it whatsoever. The other thing is that it is also a very close range weapon, so you do have to be very close to a boss, which obviously can be a little dangerous, but overall, if you get the feel for it, it is very, very good for swapping and very good for just deleting something. Now, next up is the Navigator. Now, this is another trace rifle. This is a strange trace rifle, and this is going to be kind of like Buried Bloodline. This thing has a lot of utility. You can apply Woven Mail, it can apply Sever, you can make grapple tangles with it with the Catalyst. It's also just okay for doing damage in general. It's a very, very strong support weapon. If you pair this with something like a Cenotaph Warlock, you can get so much mileage out of it. I think this is a meta-defining exotic. It is what a lot of people use for something like Strand Titan, so you can just grapple melee all the time with it. It's also just used in general for its utility as well, for applying Woven Mail and Sever. There's really not much this exotic can't do, and it's even getting buffed in Final Shape when trace rifles are getting a damage buff. So all the utility, all the damage it's getting, this is for sure an S tier exotic. It is what enables playstyles like Strand Titan, and it is one of the best support weapons in the game. Now, next up is Vex Caliber, and honestly, out of all the exotic glaives, this is one of the best ones, but even then, it's still an exotic glaive, and I don't really think you're going to take this over anything else, but I guess it is decent. It can give you a Void Overshield. It has a pretty unique firing pattern, and if you do build into it with something like a Titan, it can do some decent damage, but overall, I'm just going to throw it in C tier. It's good for utility of giving the overshield, and I guess if you do build into it again, it can pop off, but you're never going to use this over pretty much anything else in almost any PvE scenario. It's more of just a fun option. It's not bad, it's not crazy good, but it's just kind of in the middle, so that's why I'm throwing in C tier. Now, next up is Wavesplitter. Now, Wavesplitter is another trace rifle. This one's pretty unique, though. When you pick an orb up, it will overcharge, kind of like Coldheart does when you pick an Onyx trace up, but you could just pick an orb up now, which is arguably easier than Coldheart. On top of that, it can also suppress enemies, which will stun overload champions, which is nice when it is overcharged. So if you do play into a Void build, this thing can absolutely pop off, especially if you give it volatile rounds as well, and that's why I'm going to throw it into B tier. It is one of the better trace rifles in the game, in my opinion, but again, trace rifles really aren't the greatest right now, except something like Navigator and Divinity because of their utility. But again, with the damage buff coming in Final Shape, this could be moved up even higher because it is already a good option, and I'm excited to see what this thing can do when Final Shape comes out. Now, finally, we have Witherhoard. Now, Witherhoard has been one of the best exotics in the game for a while, in my opinion. They nerfed it. It's still very good. It's really good for ad clear. You can just lock down an area if you know where ads are spawning. It's really good for doing extra damage on a boss. You can shoot it on a boss, it sticks to them. On top of that, it can also buff things like Malfeasance, because this technically does make an enemy taken once you stick it to them, so that's also very, very cool, with Malfeasance also being an S tier weapon. And it also pairs extremely well with any dot damage build with something like Unravel. You can constantly proc Unravel, you can constantly proc Jolt, and if you do pair this with something like a Necrotic Grip Unravel build, you just have a ton of dot damage. And overall, I think this is going to be a meta defining exotic. It is very, very good for ad clear. It's very good for builds. It's very good for just doing extra damage on a boss. It's very good in DPS swap rotations, anything to proc bait and switch. It's very, very strong. It's one of the coolest looking exotics in the game. It's one of the strongest in my opinion, even after they nerfed it, and I would almost recommend having a Witherhoard on your team pretty much anywhere in the game. But that is my exotic special weapon tier list. Let me know what you all think about it in the comments below, and let me know where you would rank stuff as well. I will have this tier list linked in the description if you would like to put one together for yourself. And once again, these exotics were ranked off this current season. I know with Final Shape there will be some new changes coming out, and I will have a new tier list for Final Shape once it slows down a little bit. But for right now, this is my definitive ranking, and I hope you all enjoy. Anyways, though, that's going to do it all for me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great day. Peace.